okay by you.
That's fine. All right.
Bueno, les invito a todos a tomar sus asientos, por favor. Ya vamos a dar inicio a la continuación de esta mesa. So we're going to continue with the second part of this panel. If you'd like to take your seats, please. So it's my great pleasure to welcome the second speaker on this panel, Alan Braddock from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, USA. His talk is entitled Humanitas, Literae, Fruges. There's a slight change to the subtitle. The new subtitle is Humboldt and the Art of Empire. So Alan Braddock, you have the floor.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Gracias a Peter Krieger, el Instituto, P.J. Brownlee y la Fundación Terra, y gracias a todos por este coloquio. Thank you for allowing me to speak in English. You don't want to hear my Spanish much longer. As the subtitle indicates, my paper picks up on a question that came up at the end of the last session, so I look forward to your response. Can you hear me? Okay. After falling out of favor in the late 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt has enjoyed a renaissance lately, with some writers calling him a visionary, far ahead of his time. The father of the environmental movement, a proto-ecologist, and even the person responsible for the invention of nature. This celebratory revival of interest in Humboldt is worthwhile, and it's not surprising given our current planetary environmental crisis and the global scope of his knowledge. Humboldt's holistic understanding of nature in terms of interconnection and interdependence foreshadowed aspects of modern environmentalism several decades before Ernst Haeckel coined the word ecology in 1866. There's no question that Humboldt influenced many later scientists and thinkers, including Haeckel, Henry David Thoreau, George Perkins Marsh, and Charles Darwin, along with numerous artists, notably the Hudson River School landscape painter Frederick Church, who avidly drew inspiration from his romantic approach to science, combining meticulous data gathering with an aesthetic, emotional perception of nature. Many writers searching for a usable past in today's fractious climate of Trumpian neo-nationalism and decolonial critique now reclaim Humboldt for his integrated, interdisciplinary vision and relatively progressive attitudes about race, slavery, and class difference. An important recent landmark in this Humboldt revival is Andrea Wolf's widely read popular book, The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World, published in 2015 to great acclaim. Everybody I know, including members of my family, love this book for its exhilarating account of Humboldt's extraordinary life. Not unlike Humboldt's own writings, Wolf's book takes the reader on an adventurous journey through the scientific salons of Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean to Venezuela, Peru, and Ecuador, up Mount Chimborazo and down the Orinoco River, then on to Mexico City, Havana, Philadelphia, back to Europe, and eventually to Russia. Along the way, we read about Humboldt's international celebrity, including his personal acquaintances with eminent figures such as Goethe, Bolivar, and Jefferson, as well as his influence on Darwin, Thoreau, and others. Based on extensive research and reading of Humboldt's voluminous texts, Wolff's stirring narrative vividly brings this protean figure to life, rekindling for many readers something like the original 19th century experience of encountering his scientific achievements for the first time. Indeed, this emphasis on Humboldt's inventive originality, his ability to do things never done before, is a recurring theme of Wolff's book, as the title clearly announces, by seeming to credit Humboldt with nothing less than the invention of nature. That's an ambitious claim, consistent with the mountainous heights of Humboldt's own ambition. With the phrase invention of nature, Wolff specifically refers to Humboldt's innovative vision of nature as a dynamic living whole, which he viewed comprehensively through analysis of global isotherms, climate zones, plant geography, physical geography, astronomy, archaeology, and more. In addition to highlighting Humboldt's inventiveness on such matters, Wolff's book also attributes a number of other original, unprecedented contributions to him, further strengthening his reputation as a genius. Unfortunately, this tendency leads Wolff to make a number of claims that are either inflated or simply untrue, revealing a hagiographic impulse that raises questions about her account. I want briefly to highlight a few examples, not to be mean-spirited or petty, but rather to suggest the need for caution in appraising Humboldt, whose remarkable achievements in mountain ecology and other fields can inspire uncritical, celebratory fervor. I also do this because there are large issues at stake here concerning not only Humboldt's reputation, but how we view the history of ecological thought and environmental justice more broadly. Some excessive claims by Wolff involve relatively minor and inconsequential questions of fact, while others are more significant for reasons I will explain shortly. To take one minor example, consider the Brazil nut. In describing Humboldt's expedition along the Orinoco and its tributaries, Wolff observes, quote, "As they reached the most southerly point of their river expedition, with their supplies at their lowest, they found huge nuts which they cracked open for their nutritious seeds, the magnificent Brazil nut that Humboldt subsequently introduced in Europe." Her claim that Humboldt introduced Brazil nuts into Europe overlooks a much older Dutch colonial enterprise going back to the 17th century, when Netherlandish settler gardeners such as Johan Moritz cultivated this species and other Amazonian plants for a burgeoning export market. The Dutch colonial artist-explorer Albert Eckhout promoted this market by representing Brazil nuts in one of his monumental Pronkstillleben, or ostentatious still life paintings of the 1640s, which you see here. As the historian Daniela Bleichmar notes in her book Visual Voyages, the Dutch East India Company had made Holland a global merchant superpower during these years, and European viewers, Eckhout's intended audience, would have gaped with interest at the hard, rough fruits of the Brazil nut tree, split open to show the glistening seeds. By the 18th century, Dutch traders had introduced Brazil nuts into Europe as a commercial commodity long before Humboldt visited the Americas. Another problematic claim by Wolff concerns geological history, specifically the movement of tectonic plates and continental drift, which Humboldt examined through the lens of plant and physical geography in order to understand why similar species and mineral formations appeared on separate continents. According to Wolff, quote, "The similarities of their coastal plants," Humboldt wrote, "showed an ancient connection between Africa and South America, as well as illustrating how islands that were previously linked were now separated, an incredible conclusion more than a century before scientists had even begun to discuss continental movements and the theory of shifting tectonic plates." Here, Wolff refers to the 20th century work of Alfred Wegener, a German geophysicist and meteorologist who conducted extensive research on fossils, glacial deposits, and other geological evidence in formulating a modern theory of continental drift that eventually gained acceptance among scientists. Wolff's claim that Humboldt's foray on this subject amounted to an incredible conclusion more than a century before scientists had even begun to discuss it ignores several earlier precursors well known to historians of science. One of these was Abraham Ortelius, a Northern European cartographer and engraver who published an important world map and accompanying atlas in 1570. In a 1596 publication titled Thesaurus Geographicus, Ortelius discussed the idea of continental drift by saying, quote, "The Americas were torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods. The vestiges of the rupture reveal themselves if one brings forward a map of the world and considers carefully the coasts of the three continents," end quote. Ortelius did not broach plant geography, but Wolff's assertion that Humboldt was thinking about continental drift more than a century before scientists had begun to discuss it is simply wrong. In addition to Ortelius, Francis Bacon, Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, and others had also pondered the geological relationships between continents in the 17th and 18th centuries, respectively. Still another questionable claim by Wolff involves Humboldt's achievement as a mountain climber, specifically at Chimborazo. Once believed to be the highest mountain in the world, Chimborazo became Humboldt's personal emblem, thanks to his extensive analysis of its plant geography, as well as commemorative pictures by other artists, such as this one of 1806 by Friedrich Georg Weitsch, showing Humboldt and Bonpland at the foot of the great volcanic peak. In a particularly dramatic passage of her book, Wolff recounts their famous climb of Chimborazo, noting they did not reach the summit due to snowy weather conditions, though they managed to reach an altitude of 19,413 feet, which Humboldt verified with one of his scientific instruments. In another literary flourish asserting Humboldt's originality, I will never publish a book with Albert Knopf Press, obviously. In another literary flourish asserting Humboldt's originality, Wolff declares, quote, "No one had ever come this high, not even the early balloonists in Europe." Alas, even this rousing claim is false, for others had climbed higher long ago. For example, 5 centuries ago, Inca people left archaeological evidence at the summit of Mount Yuyayaco, a dormant stratovolcano rising to an elevation of over 22,000 feet in the region of Puna de Atacama on the border of what is now Chile and Argentina. As reported by the Washington Post and other news sources in 1999, a group of archaeologists led by Johann Reinhard found the mummified remains of 3 Inca girls buried in a ritual sacrifice and extraordinarily well preserved under a stone platform dating to around 1500. I could cite other examples of this tendency to inflate claims about Humboldt's originality and priority, but the mountain climbing assertion deserves special emphasis here. To say no one had ever come this high ignores and erases indigenous people and history. Such erasure gets me to the crux of my paper, for it raises large and complex questions concerning the history of European colonization, indigenous representation, and empire. While Wolff's erroneous claims might be described as inadvertent and therefore innocent, we live at a time now when such inadvertency increasingly looks to some people like a form of ongoing colonial power and privilege. In the book Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, published in 2012, the Maori indigenous scholar Linda Tuiwe Smith forcefully critiques the shortcomings of Eurocentric writing and research for perpetuating colonialism and empire by failing to take indigenous perspectives into account. From the vantage point of the colonized, says Smith, the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. It angers us when practices linked to the last century and the centuries before that are still employed to deny the validity of indigenous peoples' claim to existence, to land and territories, to the right of self-determination, to the survival of our languages and forms of cultural knowledge, to our natural resources and systems for living within our environments. Such observations make it incumbent upon us critically, to think critically, not only about popular books on Humboldt, but about his own work, especially given the current revival of interest, which sometimes echoes the adulation directed toward him during the 19th century. Here, by the way, we see Julius Schrader's adulatory portrait of Humboldt in 1859, now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, showing the elderly scientist during his last year of life, seated humbly yet towering over the mountainous peaks he made famous, a figure larger than life. Although Humboldt rightfully deserves credit for manifesting an unusual degree of liberality, tolerance, and empathetic respect toward indigenous people and other disenfranchised groups, especially when compared with his European contemporaries, we would do well to scrutinize him and our own perspectives closely in light of his extensive entanglement in forces of European empire. Even as he criticized imperial Spain, France, Russia, and the fledgling empire of democracy in the United States for their repressive social and environmental policies, Humboldt regularly interacted with and depended upon these formidable earthly powers. While he expressed misgivings about having to serve them, this should not mask the fact that his own scientific enterprise mirrored the scope and ambition of empire in various ways. Humboldt was quite forthright, in fact, about there being an imperial aspect to his pursuits, as indicated by these quotations from the introduction to Cosmos, which I now quote. "The knowledge of the laws of nature, whether we can trace them in the alternate ebb and flow of the ocean, in the measured path of comets, or in the mutual attractions of multiple stars, alike increases our sense of the calm of nature, whilst the chimera so long cherished by the human mind in its early and intuitive contemplations, the belief in a discord of elements, seems gradually to vanish in proportion as science extends her empire." This was the approved English edition of Cosmos. Moving on. According to Humboldt, science needed to be imperial in scope and ambition because nature itself was an empire of inexhaustible vastness, as he explained in the second paragraph quoted here. "We shall never succeed in exhausting the immeasurable riches of nature, and no generation of men will ever have cause to boast of having comprehended the total aggregation of phenomena. It is only by distributing them into groups that we have been able, in the case of a few, to discover the empire of certain natural laws, grand and simple as nature itself. The extent of this empire will no doubt increase in proportion as physical sciences are more perfectly developed. Today, this idea of nature's inexhaustibility looks quaintly romantic amid accelerating rates of extinction in the Anthropocene, but Humboldt lived in a world before the Great Acceleration. In any case, he regarded science positively as an empire of knowledge that could comprehend at least some of nature's empire. In the remainder of this paper, I want to show how forces and discourses of empire were so pervasive during Humboldt's life that they shaped his vision of both science and the cosmos. As an art historian, I'm interested in the visual dimensions of this phenomenon, so I will focus on one picture that expresses Humboldt's understanding of empire in particularly rich and imaginative ways. There it is on the right. Here, I draw your attention to the engraved frontispiece he commissioned and approved for his book, Geographical and Physical Atlas of the Equatorial Regions of the New Continent, published in 1814. The atlas contains 39 plates showing various geographical and physical observations by Humboldt in the Americas. At left, you see a selection of these plates, showing a map of a river in Peru, a landscape with the plant geography of Tenerife, and a diagram of the topography of New Spain, respectively. Later, in 1834, Humboldt republished this atlas with a text titled Critical Examination of the Geographical History of the New Continent and the Progress of Nautical Astronomy. Describing this publication, art historian Hugh Honor has observed, quote, "The main aim of this book was to describe the history of mankind as that of progressive knowledge and mastery of the earth by means of self-knowledge and self-mastery, a process which would finally be achieved only through universal brotherly intercourse between the races of mankind." Humboldt believed that humiliated races, as he called them, needed to participate in the advancement of civilization in order to ensure permanent prosperity in the Americas. In other words, Humboldt's empire of science could reveal and analyze mountain ecology and other details of America's vast natural resources. But long-term economic prosperity required an effective vision of universal brotherhood. In pursuit of this vision, Humboldt conceptualized the frontispiece and commissioned a prominent French painter, François Gérard, to design its composition for reproduction by an engraver named Barthélemy Roger. It depicts Minerva and Mercury, the ancient Roman gods of wisdom and commerce, standing before a defeated and deferential Aztec figure in a New World landscape, with Mount Chimborazo, Humboldt's scientific emblem, in the background, fictively transplanted from Ecuador to Mexico. As Minerva offers an olive branch of peace, Mercury extends his arm in support. To drive the point of the allegory home, Humboldt composed the explanatory caption below that reads, Humanitas Literae Fruges, or Fruges, referring to the civilizing benefits of humanity, letters, and agriculture, or the fruits of prosperity, which were described by the ancient Roman imperial writer Pliny the Younger as gifts of the Greek Empire to its conquered colonies. The vanquished indigenous figure, whose generic appearance has led scholars to speculate whether this is a priest or a priestess, kneels amid the ruins of Aztec society as dawn illuminates the distant mountain from the east, the direction from which the Europeans have arrived. Thus, the mountain ecology of Chimborazo participates here in a larger allegory about European enlightenment, bringing peace and prosperity to the conquered, benighted Americans. We know that Humboldt took great interest in this frontispiece and its allegorical significance because he corresponded with the artist about it and even advertised the print with a special supplementary notice in a later volume of his massive multi-part publication project. In the supplementary notice, which you see here at left, Humboldt explained the iconography as follows, and this is my translation of the French. The frontispiece, engraved after a design by M. Gérard, represents America consoled by Minerva and Mercury about the evils of the conquest. One reads below the picture these words, Humanitas Literae Fruges. Pliny the Younger wrote to Maximus, conqueror of Bithynia and governor of the province of Achaia, quote, "Remember the Greeks gave other peoples civilization, letters, and nourishment." These same benefits America owes to the Old World, Europe. Humboldt concluded the notice by advertising another one of his own publications as the visual source for the ruined Aztec weapons, costumes, and monuments, which he said the artist depicted with exact fidelity. Interestingly, he makes no mention of Chimborazo, probably because he, the artist, and many others tacitly understood the mountain to be an emblem of Humboldt himself and his empire of science. In a letter to the artist Gerard of 1815, written shortly after publication of the atlas, Humboldt returned proofs of the frontispiece design that the artist had sent him for approval. Referring to the design as an admirable monument of your friendship, he said, "I cannot express the various sentiments inspired by this frontispiece, and I think I can read there the extraordinary events in the midst of which you have had the noble courage to work for a friend." Humboldt's oblique reference to extraordinary events here may refer to the recent military and political convulsions across Europe, which led to the collapse of Napoleon's empire and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France in 1814, the year in which this picture appeared in print. Gerard perhaps displayed noble courage in constructing this image of European benevolence for his friend Humboldt, whose reputation for liberality put him at odds with authoritarian imperial leaders. The artist Gerard, seen here at left in a portrait by Thomas Lawrence, was indeed a good friend of Humboldt for many years, providing art lessons and hosting him at his regular evening salon gatherings, attended by celebrities and members of Parisian elite society. Gerard also produced several portraits of Humboldt, including the one at right, dated 1805, showing the young scientist seated in a French Empire-style chair with Egyptian decorative motifs inspired by Napoleon's military and archaeological campaign in North Africa. Academically trained in Paris and Rome, Gerard had studied with Jacques-Louis David, the leading French painter of the revolutionary generation. Not unlike his master, Gerard adroitly navigated the tempests of French politics by painting grand, flattering portraits of whichever authoritarian ruler was in power at the time, including Emperor Napoleon I, as well as his successor, King Louis XVIII. Gerard's expedient adaptability and willingness to serve emperors and kings, as well as liberal aristocrats like Humboldt, reveals something important, I think, about their friendship and their outlook as intellectuals facing analogous predicaments in an age of empire. In order to succeed with their respective careers, they recognized a need for strategic compromise and acquiescence in the face of imperial power. Just another page or two. Likewise, the frontispiece of Humboldt's atlas articulates a vision of compromise and acquiescence by indigenous people of the Americas as a strategic necessity for achieving the peace, prosperity, and universal brotherhood promised by the empire of science. Such a vision was perhaps less violent than outright genocide, but by framing universal brotherhood in the European imperial terms of Humanitas, Literae, Fruges, the image at best proposes cultural assimilation as the only option open for indigenous people. Here it is worth mentioning how the image participates in and updates an ancient classical European artistic tradition of depicting defeated enemies, surrendering and offering allegiance to European conquerors. See, for example, this 16th century Italian reproduction of an ancient Roman imperial relief showing the Parthians, who lived in what is now Iran, kneeling in capitulation before Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who stands at right with his fellow Romans. Though separated by centuries, both of these images present European empire as a benevolent, irresistible force that other peoples ostensibly must embrace in order to advance civilization. Another apt comparison is Jan van der Straat's widely circulated European engraving of circa 1600, depicting the arrival of Amerigo Vespucci in the New World, where he metaphorically awakens a slumbering female personification of America. Whereas Gerard used the light of dawn to project this metaphor, van der Straat rendered the idea of indigenous cultural transformation in terms of waking from sleep. As America lies supine in a hammock before a landscape populated with exotic animals and human cannibals, Vespucci, the European cartographer-explorers, stands erect at left, holding a Christian banner and a navigational instrument. Again, not a vision of violent genocide, but one that presumes European civilization to be a model for other peoples because of its advanced state of development. Humboldt's own words again provide a useful gloss to help us understand this image, as well as his broader empire of science. In the first volume of Cosmos, he said this about human difference. Whilst we maintain the unity of the human species, we at the same time repel the depressing assumption of superior and inferior races of men. There are nations more susceptible of cultivation, more highly civilized, more ennobled by mental cultivation than others, but none in themselves nobler than others. All in like degree are designed for freedom, a freedom which in the ruder conditions of society belongs only to the individual, but which in social states enjoying political institutions appertains as a right to the whole body of the community. Even as Humboldt asserted equality and freedom as intrinsic traits of all human beings, he believed that some human communities had evolved to a higher state of civilization, thanks to their political institutions, while others had not. Humboldt's frontispiece presents an allegorical encounter of two such communities in different states of civilization. Europe, represented by mythic divinities of peace and prosperity, embodies the pinnacle of human cultivation, to which America must aspire in order to succeed. This, according to Humboldt, America must accept European beneficence if it is ever to rise up out of the shadows and enter the empire of universal science and brotherhood. Humboldt's calm, harmonious vision of human difference tells us something about his place in the history of ecological ideas, a place succinctly summarized by the environmental historian Donald Worster in his classic study, Nature's Economy, A History of Ecological Ideas, with which I conclude. By and large, says Worster, there is absent from Humboldt's science a theme that would become prominent in Darwin's own ecological thought: the centrality of conflict and violence in nature. The German geographer did observe in Venezuela the uniform and saddening spectacle of man at variance with man. He also described a particularly gruesome scene of electric eels attacking horses that were swimming in a tropical river. It was more characteristic of him, however, to dwell on the harmony of nature, not its wars. For the sources for that theme, we must turn to the anti-Arcadian, post-Romantic climate in which Humboldt played no part. Humboldt espoused an essentially romantic, Arcadian view of science as a beneficent empire of knowledge that could comprehend the world in its diversity while ameliorating the devastating effects of colonization. Such a view exemplifies what the sociologist Renato Rizaldo once called imperialist nostalgia, a familiar mode of lament expressed by certain sensitive souls, Humboldt, Cole, Catlin, etc., about the destruction wrought by their own imperial regimes. If Humboldt is to serve as a model for geoaesthetics moving forward, this will require rigorous inclusion of indigenous perspectives and attention to environmental justice. Thank you. And I'm sorry that went long.
Thank you very much to Alan Braddock. That was a really interesting continuation of the previous discussion. I thought it was interesting. It's worth noting, I think, the very different role that art plays in this presentation compared to the previous one. Here, art is not so much a project of visualizing the present as you're engaging in a critique of how art and historiography creates mythologies. I think it's a really interesting counterpoint. We have a short time for questions and comments. Yes, at the front. Sorry, if you could just wait for the microphones. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a remark and I have a question. As to the remark, it seems obvious that indigenous knowledge, also in our time, has been confronted with exactly the same paradigms as you have been just mentioning before, you know, in the time of Humboldt. Giving an example, in all the recent, let's say like the last 5-year COP conferences from the UN as to climate change, beginning the COP21 in Paris, all the indigenous knowledge has never been included in the so-called high segment panels. This form of knowledge seems not to be accurate, even though it has been a totally holistic point of view and might be for policymakers and for the politics and so on of a big
Great point.
relevance. So we have to be aware about that. This is very, very up to date at this time as well. And my question is, talking about the knowledge of the scientific empire, how did Humboldt look at it? It was just natural science, or did it include philosophy? Did it include the aesthetics?
Oh,
or
yes.
Did it include it? So it included both.
Yeah, and it should not be equated with the empire of Napoleon, with its destructive military conquest. It's in some ways closer to Napoleon's description of Egypt, you know, the scientific knowledge gathering that in some ways was a corollary to that more violent imperial conquest. Although I would say that Humboldt is even different from Napoleon's description of Egypt in some ways because of his more holistic understanding, his integration of human archaeology with geological history and botanical history and many other sort of more than cultural fields. So he does deserve great credit, no question about it, as imagining an integrated approach to knowledge. That much we can certainly take away from Humboldt. I'm just insisting that integrated knowledge must take into consideration diverse human knowledges and stories and histories. And while he did acknowledge the presence of indigenous people, he's not our contemporary in recognizing the need for this sort of decolonial approach to knowledge.
Thank you. Just a quick compositional question, if you've thought about it in terms of this image, and is the Greeks or the classical figures are standing on the right, whereas the indigenous figure is standing framed, obviously, under the mountain.
Yes.
And then I find that there's like a dichotomy there, because then the figure is kind of submissive, but at the same time the mountain, but at the same time the mountain is very firm and very strong, very high rising. But then at the same time, the fact that he or she is framed under the mountain also allows for this kind of dominion of nature, right?
Yeah.
That nature is part of this indigenous culture that can actually be helped or dominated or seen through empire. So there's this really strange thing going on there.
I think those are wonderful observations and another indication of the subtlety with which Humboldt and Girard considered these questions and how art might summarize them allegorically. As we know, Bolivar took great inspiration from Chimborazo and volcanic activity in general as a revolutionary force. And I wanted to see that in this image, but I'm not sure that I do.
And then her pose is completely triangular. It's a
Yeah. Stability, the calm that Humboldt strove for in science.
One more question. Yeah.
En español, por favor. La imagen, refuerzo lo que ella dice. A mí me parece en las culturas prehispánicas los volcanes eran dioses. Son dos dioses sacando adelante a un tercer dios y creando el triángulo de los dioses. Es decir, estás hablando de dos figuras muy importantes, de dos triadas que hablan no de alguien caído, hablan de un Dios que están levantando otra vez a que sea otra vez postura de Dios. Creo más en eso.
Could you help me with a little of that?
I'll try. So he was talking about the...
Gracias.
I'll try in English.
Yeah. Well, you probably do it better than me trying to, yeah.
Well, for me, it's important to imagine that in pre-Hispanic cultures, the volcano, it's a symbol of God. Okay, it is the power of God.
It's another deity in the
so,
scene.
I'm sure that those two Greek gods are not helping the defeat people. It's helping the defeat God. So it's very important to understand that probably the thing is we're talking about triangles. You're seeing the volcano is a triangle, and the form that those three gods make also is another triangle. So it's a very powerful image.
Yes.
If you analyze the composition and what is the subject, which is, it's a little bit hide in the image, I can think.
Gracias. Those are wonderful observations, and I will take them to heart in thinking more about this picture. I still can't help thinking of how Girard, in collaboration with Humboldt, felt the freedom to transplant Chimborazo to this scene ostensibly in Mexico, creating a kind of ensemble of indigeneity that was somewhat generic. The details, in many cases, are based on his archaeological analysis of Aztec weapons and clothing, but in some ways the image does violence to the integrity of indigenous communities that are different from one another and in different places by putting them all in one image to have this encounter of America and Europe. So it's a very complex image.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Alan Braddock for that.
Thank you very much. Gracias por todo.
Okay, our next speaker is Jens Baumgarten. So next speaker is Jens Baumgarten from the Universidade Federal de Sao Paulo in Brazil. His talk is entitled John Moore, Pico de Jaraguá, Sao Paulo, 1812.
Buenas tardes, boa tarde a todos. Então, I will not continue to speak in Portuguese, so everybody can be calm. I'm happy to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation of PG and Peter, and it made me really to think about very new things, and I try to combine them with some of my research. So I gave a new title because I sent in the image, but with no title. So the title is the Pico di Jaraguá, a mountain to divide, a mountain to unite. And actually that was also one of the comments in the morning. So I'm happy that I can take this up. When we presented when we gathered together 2 weeks ago at the CIHA in Florence, which will continue in 2 years in Sao Paulo, we read a statement, a communication about the situation in Brazil, and perhaps less light. Thank you. So this is the situation. Actually, so when you talk about environment and what's going on in Brazil, so these are only 2 images, but I want to remember you, and I also want to remember you the destruction of the nature, the destruction of environment goes hand in hand with the destruction of culture and the destruction of education. So, and I will come to this later, but I want to show you these images as some preliminary comments with these images. So the objective of, no, sorry, this was too fast. I have to go, no, I leave that. The objective of the colloquium is not either to commemorate the 250th birthday of Alexander von Humboldt by joining hagiographic presentations, nor to resemble in a positivist approach his influence in the different sciences, natural or cultural, all over the world, but his thinking, his approaches, and should stimulate us to reconceptualize art history, image science, or whatever name we would like to give our field of knowledge and cognition about images, artifacts, and objects. In his theoretical article, Otto Frenzer developed some ideas how Humboldt's holistic world view can be understood in relation to today's discussions about inter- and transdisciplinary ecological research. He argues that exploring travels and geography were 2 necessarily interdependent prerequisites for a deeper understanding of the world. Especially his travel to the Americas made his scientific knowledge realistic and substantial. But Humboldt doesn't stand alone. The contemporary scientific literature before James Hutton, Forster, Linné, Kant, and Humboldt himself were less interested in detailed generic analysis, but aimed primarily at defining interrelationships. Frenzler also sees in his work of Linné a physical-theological thought with many ecological relationships. Humboldt developed in his essay sur la géographie des plantes his holistic view. I quote, "It was generally held belief that sciences were to reveal new phenomena to the artists and to painters in particular, who were attributed with the ability to bring about the best and immediately comprehensible representation of nature. In the realm of science, this unifying worldview led to an emphasis on physiognomy, in particular with regard to man, plants, landscapes, and not least in landscape gardening. In a further step, Humboldt refers to the global impact, Totaleindruck, that an observer has of a region. To realize, he creates so-called word pictures as response to the tropical landscape in South America. Humboldt's epistemological interest in relation to the nature by comparative analysis with many interrelationships can be understood in a way that natural sciences were a necessary element of aesthetics. Therefore, inter-indicative phenomena was seen analogous to the spiritual substance of a material entity. Frenzler can show how today's analysis of real ecological communities with their bewildering complexity could be better understood with Humboldt's idea of comparative assessment. He puts in the terms unity in complexity, quest for unified ecosystem theory. For the art history, ecology appeared in the traditional historiography, mainly in landscape painting and later in land art. For the Western modern aesthetic tradition, Mark Cheetham discussed in his article about the ethics of earth art as catalytic theory converter. In the recent years, many case studies were published about South Asia, beyond what we say about North America and Europe. I remember the workshop organized by Dipti Kera and Hannah Bader, as well as the book published this year, edited by Dinin Deli, Eco Art History in East and Southeast Asia. Sorry for my spleen, always to mention what I'm not able to present more profoundly, but I'm very curious and I do hope to discuss it here more. In this paper, it can't be the objective to re-establish Humboldt's approaches, as I mentioned before, but as I try to say with my title, to understand the object of my research as natural, physical, but also artistic cultural objects inscribed in different cultural processes that must be contextualized historically, but also again deconstructed in the tense relation between epistemology and ontology as realm of thinking and realm of objects. Perhaps you have expected, and therefore I wanted to show you this, the most well-known mountain of Brazil, the Corcovado, with the statue of Christ, its relation to the fusion of city and landscape, and its historic context with the movement of ultramountanism construction of Sacré-Cœur in Paris, and also its ecological meaning in Paris and in Rio de Janeiro. But I would like to present my case study about the Pico de Jaraguá, which is the highest peak in Sao Paulo with 1,135 meters. Geologically, it belongs to the Serra da Cantareira, the most important area for the water supply for the megalopolis of Sao Paulo. The Pico de Jaraguá can be seen as the entrance to the Altiplano of Brazil. I show you some pictures of different angles that you have an idea. Or the beginning of the descent to the Atlantic coast. So it really is the division between the Altiplano and the coastal area. On the top of the mountain, 2 antenna towers today were installed for the 3 TV channels, TV Globo, TV Bandeirantes, and TV Cultura. Around the top of the mountain, there's the only natural park, which is also the only indigenous reservation within the borders of the city. In the following, I would like to present my case study in 3 interpretaments, which means in parts of intertwined partial approaches, or in a metaphorical way, an image by means of which a reality different from the image is interpreted. In this sense, I am stimulated by the holistic concept of Humboldt, but I have to deconstruct it. But let me come to this point later. The 3 interpretaments are, first, geology and colors, John Moore. From science and silhouettes, and third, ecotourism and anthropology. So I show you here a different angle. This is the view around, so you see that it is within the city borders. Here, a view of the silhouette. I come also back to the silhouette. Here, a view without the antenna of the late 19th century. Here, a view from the top of the Pico de Jaraguá. And here, the theater in of the Pico. And here you have a view from Google Maps that you know also. It is really, so it's the larger area of Sao Paulo. It's completely surrounded by the city. And I come to this. So geology and colors, John Moore, the British traveler in Brazil. The image I have sent to this colloquium belongs to a series of images by the English geologist John Moore, who traveled to Brazil between the years 1807 and 1811. We can see him as a counterpart to Humboldt, who intended to travel to Brazil, but it was during a time when the ports were closed for foreigners by the Brazilian authorities. Only after the expulsion of the Portuguese king by Napoleon, his rescue by the British Marine, and his transfer of his capital to Rio de Janeiro allowed travelers like Moore, but also others like the Germans von Martius, Spitz, and the French Debray to visit Brazil. His work, Moore's work, is entitled Travels to the Interior to Brazil, particularly to the gold and mine districts. The frontispiece show the condition of the black slaves washing for diamonds. Moore just mentioned that they are Negroes, in quotation marks, but not their social status. The print shows clearly the almost industrial production and destruction of the environment. In his dedication, he declares his objective very blunt. So the dedication is to John VI of Portugal. I quote, "Unbiased, either by partiality or prejudice, I have endeavored to give a clear and faithful relation of what I've seen in describing the present state of mining and agriculture in your dominion. I've taken the liberty to suggest some improvements which, in my humble opinion, would tend to increase the revenue of your Royal Highness and multiply the resources of the country. These are the principal grounds on which I rest my hope that the work, notwithstanding its imperfection, will be found not unworthy of being patronized by a prince whose happiness consists in promoting that of his subjects." Unquote. His chapter on Sao Paulo, which is the most interesting for our context, follows the organization of his book by describing the geographical situation, the environment, the agriculture, the mining, and the social and cultural context. Oh no, sorry. Chapter 5, description of St. Paul. I quote, "System of farming prevalent in its neighborhood." Excursion to the gold mines of Jaraguá. Mode of working them, return to Santos. The first paragraph is on various accounts interesting, by comparing it to the actual situation of the megalopolis, by comparing it to the climate in Sao Paulo today, and last, by comparing it to the representation of the city by landscape painting like Enders. This is from Enders. I quote, St. Paul's is situated on a pleasing eminence of about 2 miles in extent, surrounded on 3 sides by low meadowland and washed at the base by rivulets, which almost insulate it in rainy weather. So, you know, we had a water crisis 2 years ago, and there is no rain anymore in Sao Paulo already. It is connected with the highland by narrow ridge. The rivulets flow into a pretty large stream called the Tietê, which runs within a mile of the town in the southwest direction. Over them are several bridges, some of stone and other of wood, built by the late governor. The pavement of the city is an alluvial formation containing gold, many particles of which metal are found in the chinks and hollows after heavy rains, and at such seasons are diligently sought by the poorer sort of people. Unquote. Finally, he arrives to describe the mountains. Beyond the plain, which nearly encircles St. Paul's, the country is hilly, or rather mountainous, and you can see this picture is illustrating it. Beyond the plains, which nearly encircles, he recognized the gold mines, which you can see here, of Jaraguá as one of the first discovered in Brazil, which now belong together with a farm to the governor. Very clearly, he focused on the devastation by the mining to the environment. I quote, "It was melancholy to behold a territory which, for its teeming soil and general climate, deserves to be called a paradise, neglected and solitary like that of Eden after the fall, while its infatuated possessors, like the offspring of Cain, hungering for gold, kept aloof from the rich feast which nature had spread before them." It is interesting that his book about, and there I want to go back to this, about Brazil and the representation of people are in black and white, whereas the images of minerals were always in color. In the English-speaking world, he is mainly well known because of his publication about geology and mineralogy. The print I've sent shows exactly the situation of the devastation on the foot of the Pico de Jaraguá and the waterfalls that were constructed to wash the gold. Continuing his narrative, he is ambiguous. He is describing the gold mines by the terms of the Portuguese, eulogizing, for example, Peru of Brazil. Then he's describing the hard labor of the workers in neutral terms. And finally, he also wants to find gold and is personally frustrated not to have found even 1 ounce of gold. The most astonishing part is that he's describing all this very clear, but in no word he's referring to the situation of the slaves. He calls them worker, Negroes, etc. This is even more astonishing of the parallel ongoing abolitionist debate in Great Britain in this time. For sure, it is dedicated to the Portuguese king, but it seems to be a blind spot as he's not even referring to it. This is maybe also polemic debate parallel to the discussions about slavery and Humboldt, which also shows, as I said in the beginning, the relation between the discourse of the environment and those of racism and slavery until today. And that shows the concept of the capitalist concept of exploitation of human people and of environment. So this is very connected here, as you can see that. So the second part, planned nature, planned paintings, and the silhouette. Since the colonial times, the Pico de Jaraguá was not only a melancholic memory of the traveler John Moore, but also a place where different gardens concepts have been realized. Unfortunately, we don't have any documents of the gardens themselves. But I would like to come to my point how the representation of the Pico de Jaraguá turned into an icon of the city of Sao Paulo. In the first landscape painting, like of Thomas Ender, I've shown you before, the Pico de Jaraguá was a mountain in the background at the horizon of the city. Especially from the early 20th century, the mountain developed for the immigrants to a symbol of the new land, like Evandro Carlos Frasca. I show you just the examples because I want to go further with my argument. So these are very often immigrants from Italy who bring their idea of a Western landscape painting. Enders is there. And so the Pico de Jaraguá, but here it turns with one of the modernists, it's now related to the city. So this is architecture from the city, and here we have a first relation with the city. And this, the development was intensified by the photography, which only showed the silhouette of the city. The Pico de Jaraguá turned into an architecture of the city itself. It was swallowed up by the megalopolis. So it's also this religious aspect, and this is with the photography, so it becomes a part of the city. Sorry. And here it is finished. So here the city is, the Pico de Jaraguá is part of the city, and it becomes the image of the city. The architecture group, Nietzsche turned this into an environmental critique against the verticalization of the megalopolis of Sao Paulo. So here you have the critique of a group. In this sense, we can follow Martina Löw, who argues that space can be conceived only in relational terms as a structure-forming, habitualized and materialized arrangement of objects. In this sense, we can say that space is an intrinsic aspect of everything human being do, but also the ecological aspect. So the natural Pico de Jaraguá turns into a human architecture and is swallowed up. It doesn't exist anymore as nature. I come to my last point, ecotourism and anthropology. Let me come to my last interpretation. There is no gold digging anymore in the Pico de Jaraguá. We're happy for that. But this conflict continues. The so-called ecotourism is getting stronger. The participants believed they don't put the environment in danger. Just to remind, only 10% of the native coastal forest has survived, and the Pico de Jaraguá is a very unique example of cultural and natural heritage. Also, the re-establishment of the only indigenous reservation within the city of Sao Paulo is still endangered. The quarrels at court are going on, and the continuation of the indigenous community is not sure. And you can imagine with the now government, it is really a danger that they will be expelled from this reservation. So I show you just very fast. So this is indigenous community, but if you see, so I want to show you how the environment ecotourism works. So these are, you can find online, they show you how you should go up. And when you see what is the impact of the ecotourism, you can see here there's a road. And this is already the devastation in the natural reservation. So it is, you can't say that this is really preserved. And you see here, so these are the photos the ecotourism published. So you can see the animals, and even the people are really, they are killed on their bikes when they go into this ecotourism. So even they put it, so it's a very strange kind of imagery, of an iconography of challenge. So they challenge themselves, and they still challenge the nature with it. And this is, I couldn't go more into that to bring this together, but it's very important to bring this together with the Pico de Jaraguá. So I wanted to show you these images. And this is the indigenous community. So and now I come to my final point. Because the question is the cosmological thinking of the Guarani, which we can see here. And finally, I'm on. People differs profoundly to the Western ideas, especially in relation of epistemology and ontology, which I mentioned in the beginning, which I still explain in a few moments, which I will now explain, not in a few moments, now. I also want to stress already that we have taken this into account if we analyze the mountain, the Pico de Jaraguá, with an indigenous belief system. The Guarani, and I'm really say the Guarani, but we actually should be very detailed. This is not the Guarani is like the word for all these groups, but it is a very certain, but I doing it in a nutshell now. Within the Guarani don't know holy mountains like here in Mexico or in Peru, so this is a very big difference. But they have fundamental different ideas about the relation of nature and man. It is important for our context that they attribute to their myth by means of social understanding, a search for collective consent. In these myths, they look for the land of overseas. Ivi Mara E, the land without evil. Since the early times of colonization, the so-called Banderange and the Jesuits disputed over the strategies to prioritize catechism and economic exploitation and natural exploitation. In this last step, I would to include some reflection of Eduardo Vieira de Castro about his approach of perspectival anthropology. And this to rethink art history within an eco-art history, to transform it. It is not by coincidence that for Castro the basic method of anthropology is comparison, like the fundamental methods of art history since Rolfing. But comparability doesn't mean translatability, which is fundamental to understand the juxtapositions, superimpositions. But I also think this can be established for transdisciplining art history. Castro establishes a perspectivist theory of trans-Pacific personhood, which is unicultural and multi-natural. He proposes the notion of equivocation. So difference, and this is the main difference, is located in the bodily difference between species for the body and its affections, in the site and instrument of ontological differentiation and referential disjunctions. In this sense, perspectivism supposes a constant epistemology and variable ontology. So this is the main difference of a Western thinking. So we have one epistemology and multiple ontologies. In this sense, and applying to my example, Viveros continues, I'm always losing then my sentence. Sorry. in this sense. In this sense, and applying to my example, Viveros continues the crucial differences between the diversity of subjects are situated on the plane of the body and not the spirit. So this is different to Humboldt. So it is not the holistic way, but it's inverted. So if we bring this together with Viveros, we have to invert the Humboldtian thinking. I'm coming to my end, conclusion. Coming from the approaches of Alexander von Humboldt, the example of the Pico di Jaraguá inverts the idea. As Humboldt, with his holistic theory and approach, is able to serve a father for our cultural sciences, I wanted to show how an object, in this case, the Pico di Jaraguá, can condense in its symbolic but also in its material existence an intertwined network of epistemological and ontological qualities. The main question was to show what are the methodological consequences for an art history that considers ecological questions. I have analyzed in other contexts transcultural objects by including anthropological theories and methodologies, especially Eduardo Vivero di Castro and José Luis Martinez. So what I couldn't show you here is to go into the community and to make pictures and so on, because this is field work which needs 1 year, and I could go there, but I couldn't make pictures. So I cannot describe, but this is also respect, and otherwise I would be the neo-colonial person. Also, in this presented case studies, both anthropological, including animism approaches, would be helpful to create an ecological art history. As art history has always benefited from other fields of knowledge and their epistemic debates and shifts, I would consider that these South American anthropologists are able to contribute the most for our field. Also, I wanted to show, beside his openness, in quotation marks, that Humboldt is inscribed into Western epistemology, which were criticized by anthropologists. As shown above, the ecological art history is especially developed by South Asian art historians. In a comment on Nurit Bird David's article, Vivero criticized her that she is not considering the American cultural context. It is an interesting twist, and it seems to repeat the discussion on the post-colonial between Homi Bhabha and Walter Mignolo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jens, for that really interesting, complex account of the meanings that accumulate around the figure of the Pico de Jaraguá. I thought there were some really interesting links with the previous papers, and specifically one thing that stuck in my mind was the way that you compare art history with contemporary ecotourism, and this image of the cyclist and this whole discourse of the intrepid has a lot of resonances with Humboldt in a curious way that was in the previous paper. Anyway, we have a short time for questions and comments. Yes.
Thank you. That was terrific. I really enjoyed it. I'm completely convinced by what you have to say about the mountain becoming a kind of architecture or being incorporated as the built environment of the city. And that led me to think about the picture or the illustration by Moore of the enslaved laborers working, because that illustration itself seems to transform them into a kind of architecture, right? Yeah. And so then that led me to ask, in the context of eco-criticism, if we're imagining it as a kind of latter-day colonial enterprise, right? Ecotourism as a form of colonialism or imperialism. How does it figure the bodies of the actual humans that live in this area? Are they also architectural? How are they configured as beings in that landscape? I mean, is there an imaginary within the context of ecotourism of indigenous populations? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, what I'm asking? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Sure. No, thank you very much. That's I couldn't get deeper into the interpretation of this print, which is very extremely problematic. Exactly what you said. I agree completely. It's also the people. It's the repetition. It's like a machine. It shows it's kind of a industrial form of exploitation, of gold digging, and so on. I agree. The question of, and that is exactly the problematic part of this ecotourism, which is funded by the state. And the state is arguing against the reservation for the indigenous. So, and this has to be contextualized. So, who are helping? Who are giving? Are the non-governmental organization, but they are seen, and even more. So, there's this kind of obsession. Every non-governmental organization is communist and whatever. So therefore, they have also problems to gain money. So this ecotourism actually is something of new colonial exploitation. It's going on. So in a certain form, certain groups go there, and they even feel very comfortable because they're doing something for the environment, which exactly they don't. It's the opposite. So, and you can see this even in their own images, their photographs. So they're making photographs, and you can see they're destroying the environment, and they don't see it. So this is a form of many blind spots in Brazilian discourse and in Brazilian iconology right now. So, and I would explain this because Brazilian culture, I would explain in many ways, is also related to animism. Even so, when there is a Western discourse, it is related to animism. So this kind of discourses we have to understand in many ways differently. So therefore, I wanted to bring this last part. So this animistic thoughts are also in discourses that we think are not this completely Western. So we can't. Sometimes it is not possible to translate. Even so, it's a false friend. So I couldn't bring this, the idea of false friend, which is also rooted in Vivero di Castro. So this has thought to be together.
Any more questions, comments? I was thinking as well in terms of ecological discourses and in relation to the previous question. You began your talk with these images of the Amazon today, the Amazon burning, and I was thinking of Bolsonaro and the way that he invokes a kind of anti-imperial discourse in relation to Macron and the European attempts to fund putting out the fires in the Amazon, etc., etc. So I think it's a really fascinating intervention on how eco-criticism and racism have this really problematic kind of partnership. And I was wondering if you go back thinking about the previous papers and Humboldt, you're talking about this English geologist Moore. How can you kind of draw a line between? A kind of line of continuity between these discourses in the 18th century, the 19th century, and the kind of ways in which these discourses are articulated today, or is that
okay? To draw the line, perhaps.
Well, not necessarily a line of continuity.
You give me a little bit more time.
Yeah,
no, but first to start with the end, so to say, to start with Bolsonaro. So he's using, when I'm very superficial, I would say he's using just the term of anti-colonial, anti-imperialistic. He's just using the term. So because this brings him applause for his nationalistic ideas. So but that would be superficial. But what he's doing, it's quite quite more complex, because he's evoking an image of Brazil as so what you can find in the national anthem. So the sleeping giant of nature. So this is like the image. So he's evoking this image, and therefore I said this is animistic in the way this is in a way that is adored. And you can see that when he's also, like, in the same time, there was an image, I almost wanted to show it, an image of two kissing Marvel heroes. And the person who just bought like 10, I don't know, 5,000 of them and gave them for free, he's now threatened by death. So the image is not only the image, so it is more. So the image is real. So the discourse of Bolsonaro for 1/3 of the population, it is real. It is not a representation. So that's very important to understand. So therefore, that is because it is so complicated to understand when I say 70 million people in Brazil believe that the earth is flat. So, you have to understand that. So and it's not, you can't explain it just with lack of education. So saying by that. And then Brazil wasn't visited by Humboldt. So also this Brazil has a different history within Latin America. This is also very important to say. It has a later discourse rather with the French, not with Germans. So I can't make a line. I can tell you about Bolsonaro. I would put that. And how this is related, but it also, to say very blunt, so in a certain way, the critique to Europe, they haven't also done their homework. So this is for sure. But the consequences are completely insane to say, okay, Europe has destroyed and the US have destroyed their forests. Okay, this gives us the right to destroy our forests. So that is the insane part of it. But
great. Well, thank you very much.
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Jens Baumgarten for his really interesting talk. And the last paper of this morning's session is by Verónica Uribe from the Universidade de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. And her paper is entitled Charles Empson, The Rustic Corridor, Narratives of South America, Illustrating Manners, Customs, 1836.
Yo puse en ver y presentar pantalla completa. O presentación. A ver si quieres avanzar un poco. No. Por ahí se ve como torcido. Hay presentación, tal vez. No, yo creo que es pantalla completa. Pero entonces hay que reducirlo un poquito. ¿Qué queda? 88. No. 90. Ah, pero mira, al pasarlo. Como con 95. Pero si la paso, lo que hace es moverse. Bueno, o si no, préstame el mouse. Aquí. Bueno,
Okay, so whenever you're ready, Veronica.
Yes,
Thank you.
okay.
Thank you.
I'll do it manually with the mouse. So I will continue adding to the thank you notes, Dr. Krieger and Dr. Brownlee, and the Terra Foundation and UNAM for having us here at this fantastic event. Okay. Looks a little bit small. Sorry about this. No funciona. No permite pasar la presentación completa. No la lee como presentación. De pronto, bueno, yo lo hago manual, no pasa nada. Ok, entonces dejémoslo ahí. Ok, let's leave it. Dejémoslo así para que. Está bien, dejémoslo así para no tardarlo más, vale. Okay, we'll work with that. So at the beginning of his South American memoirs, British botanist, bookseller, and traveler Charles Empson mentions Humboldt's glorious descriptions and the fact that these had induced many persons who had no other motive beyond that of beholding nature in all her majesty to explore these regions so gorgeously clothed in primeval vegetation and so abundant in every production interesting to mankind. The Rustic Corridor, one of 15 watercolors that illustrate narratives of South America, illustrating manners, customs, and scenery, containing also numerous facts in natural history, collecting during a 4 years residence in tropical regions, published in 1836 after his little-known trip during the 1820s, represents Humboldtian aesthetic mountain observation at a very early stage of the Colombian Republic's interest in landscape. The formal and conceptual composition of this drawing determines a series of premises inherited from Humboldt's lessons, which I consider essential to explore and that characterize Empson's drawings, which are filled with a British picturesqueness turned into watercolor, bridges, mountains, tree trunks, and coarse objects that delight the eye. First, the generic title of this watercolor and its depiction of a specific geographical place that can be identified, but whose central purpose is definitely not scientific exactitude. Second, Empson's intentional representation of an architectural structure used to observe the immensity of the snow-capped mountains in the distance. This construction includes two elements, the corridor of a cottage and a balcony that frame and support the act of looking. Third, the importance of subjective observation as the main narrative in the image. In this case, locals, dressed in traditional hats and ruanas, observe the vista either alone or in pairs. In the scene that Empson creates, the campesinos escape the productive relationship to the mountains and to the valley beneath them as they stop on their journeys to engage in active contemplation of the landscape. The illustration embraces a feeling of universality where there is a viewer of the mountain range, but there is also a spectator watching the onlookers. The solitary beholders of this magnificent place represent a new type of Colombian citizen who, through a rustic window, witness the millenary peaks of the Andes that have recently become part of a modern republic. Like many other travelers, Empson builds this image in resonance with Humboldtian ideas of distance, infinity, splendidness, solitude, observation, interconnectedness, and universality, while being faithful to Gilpin's British picturesque by seeking the imperfect, the unfinished, the rough, and the uneven. Does the place represented in the Rustic Corridor exist geographically? As was common with these travelogues, Empson describes the landscape with more detail in the text than in the image, and I quote his own text. On the left is seen the volcano of Tolima and the promontories which are called the Tetas, from the same peculiar form as that from which the Paps of Jura has derived their appellation. On the right are plains of which you cannot see the termination. Turn around, if you throw your head back sufficiently to obtain the requisite position, you behold the summit of the giant Andes, those ribs of the world, as they have been powerfully denominated, their lofty pinnacles capped with snow, cold, dead, and pallid, during the noontide blaze. But view them again. When saluted by the sun's first rays, they are tinged with a faint blush, like that on a maiden's cheek, deepening to a roseate hue as the sun ascends, like the brighter color which betrays emotions that language could not reveal. Reading this, we can look at a map and understand that Empson was standing at some point near Las Juntas on the famous passage of Quindío, the same route that Humboldt and other travelers crossed to get from the eastern to the western slope of the Central Cordillera. So right here, and then right over here. This highly recorded passage allowed travelers to connect from the valley of the Magdalena River to the valley of the Cauca River. The viewpoint is geographically close to that of Humboldt's print, Passage of Quindío in the Andes. Humboldt's Colombian prints have been previously studied by Marta Herrera, who identified the different geographical elements in the image. In views of the Cordilleras, Humboldt described this specific site. The middle range divides the waters between the Magdalena River basin and that of the Rio Cauca. It often reaches the perpetual snow line, and it surpasses the latter by far in the colossal peaks of Guanacas, Barragán, and Quindío. At sunrise and sunset, the middle range presents a magnificent spectacle to the inhabitants of Santa Fe. It recalls the view of the Swiss Alps, but on a more impressive scale. Empson titles the image the Rustic Corridor, a name that sets the location in the context of picturesque aesthetics and even gives explicit instructions in terms of altitude and pose when he involves the reader. The fact that the title does not specify geographical exactitude allows for this illustration to capture the imagination of both the reader and the viewer and to act as an avatar for the notion of spectacular Andean views. This place is many places on the Cordillera. As observers, we are meant to create a visual bond with the faraway magnificence of the mountains and with the people who are on the rough and coarse structure of the cottage, contemplating the view in a dynamic act, perfectly known to Romanticism and its knowledge of nature as spectacle. This imitates the relationship that Humboldt created between text and image, where his literary description of the crossing of the Quindío region is expressed clearly by González when she says that impeccable landscape with such a clear and wide road contradicts itself with Humboldt's text, where he spoke of the muddled paths and the difficulties found in moving forward. The textual descriptions of these 19th century travel diaries and memoirs are usually more credible than their visual equivalents. If Empson is standing at Las Juntas looking northeast, according to the actual physical map, the approximate distance between the snow-capped volcano and the tetas of Huambeima is approximately 12 miles or 19 kilometers, which could make sense from Empson's vantage point. However, when we map this angle, it seems unlikely that he can actually see the three promontories as close together as he represents them on the watercolor. Especially off is the distance between mountains number 1 and number 2 from left to right. Even if the author does see the peaks at the apparent closeness, where are the other mountains that we know would lie in between, those called Las Damas, or the ladies? Also, the elevation of these mountains on the drawing is very improbable. The volcano on the left is 17,109 feet, and the tetas have an elevation of 11,568 feet above sea level. The 5,000 feet difference is not evidenced in the image. Quite the contrary, the middle mountain is higher than the volcano. Even less likely is the fact that the tetas de Huambeima would have had snow at this known altitude. Obviously, this license in geographical truthfulness is due first to the fact that these published drawings were finished in England years after the trip was completed. They were based on sketches, and they depended highly on the memory of the voyager. Second, that the actual function of the colored prints was that of illustrating. Images were, in most cases, contingent to the text. Another evident observation when contrasting this drawing with other examples of the same period is the shape of the Tolima volcano on the illustration. Most images, including Humboldt's, intentionally confirm the obviously flattened surface of the crater. The Chorographic Commission of the 1850s produced images of the same volcano by artists and travelers such as Henry Price. Other images include those by German painter Albert Berg, who befriended and corresponded with Humboldt, and by Italian painter Giovanni Ferroni, who at the end of the century created a highly angled view. In any case, these are current photographs of how the volcano, the Tolima volcano and the Nevado del Ruiz are seen from Bogota, from the Monserrate, which would be the tallest point in Bogota. In any case, Empson's volcano seems generalized, schematic, and far away from in situ observation. I can debate that a reliable scientific image of this specific point of the Andes was not his main objective. Quite the contrary, Empson's interest in Humboldtian thought was inclined towards the musings of picturesque effects, such as those found in views of the Cordillera, where Humboldt explained, "I was less interested in depicting those scenes and their picturesque effect than in representing the exact contours of the mountains, the valleys that furrow their sides, and the impressive waterfalls formed by plunging torrents. The Andes are to the high Alps what the Alps are to the Pyrenees. Everything romantic or grand that I have seen on the banks of the Saverne in northern Germany, in the Euganian hills, in the central mountain range of Europe, or on the steep slope of the volcano of Tenerife, this is all combined in the Cordilleras of the New World." If we compare Empson's Rustic Corridor with other landscape included in his own narratives, it is evident that Empson is highly versed and trained in watercolor drawing techniques. In most images, he intentionally uses formal elements such as atmospheric perspective, proportion, and scale. In Peladeros, Tolima, or Rio Claro, he creates much more contrast between the represented peaks with clear differences in the use of light, sharpness, altitude, and specific shape of individual mountains. Foregrounds are highly contrasted, but this can also be attributed, again, to the fact that the Rustic Corridor is unique in its setting and composition because of the indisputable will to frame human surveillance as an act of appropriation. Empson's purpose in depiction has been shifted from nature to the subjects observing the landscape. In South American Cottage or in El Salto, humans fulfill their role as spectators, but the preconceived frame is replaced by other elements, such as the hut or the bridge, and more emphasis is placed on the detailed representation of natural elements like water, palm trees, or delicate flowers. When one looks carefully at these illustrated memoirs, this drawing stands out from the rest because it is the only one that includes the architectural structure that frames the composition. The image shows a balcony where three separate groups of observers look out towards the three snow-capped mountains that are centered between three of the structure's visible wooden posts. Charles Empson created a classically composed image that could synthesize a view from one of the slopes of the Cordilleras, an image that would summarize Andean vistas for the whole of his text. This drawing represents both the individual and collective acts of contemplation seen from a specific framework that willingly appears to be a casual system that organizes nature into landscape for both onlookers in the drawings and the viewers of the image. When Empson described the specific site in the text, he said, "This sketch was taken from the corridor of a cottage built on the eastern slope of the Andes. Travelers, to whom almost every portion of the globe is familiar, have acknowledged, while gazing upon this spot, that they never held such a sublime spectacle." The real foreground of this splendid panorama could not be represented by the pencil. The dark ravine in which you look is beautiful beyond conception, extending to the very base of the snow-clad Cordilleras. One of the issues proposed by the image is also that of proportion. The author specifically mentions that this structure is a corridor of a cottage, but when the image is analyzed carefully, the size of the beholders seems evidently small in comparison with the height of the supposed cottage and in comparison with rural cottages throughout the country in general. The height of the posts in no means seems to represent the size of what we may understand by the term cottage. The observers are very small in comparison to the spatial agreement of this human-built element that is responsible for the act of contemplation, plus all of the humans are framed inside the posts. This structure is made compositionally interesting by the horizontal balcony that closes the square frame, but leaves enough breathing space on the right-hand side of the image. you can see it, where it is replaced by a small, lonely palm tree. Both the vertical axis, emphasized by the 3 poles and the palm tree, and the horizontal support of the balcony organize a mathematical space where the organic mountains and slopes can exist as a human-built view. Even if we compare this framework in proportion with other examples of cottages represented by Empson, Groot, Price, or Church, taking an average height of 160 meters or 5'2", and multiplied by 4 times, which seems to be the relation between human and pole in the Rustic Corridor, would mean that this cottage has an approximate height of 6.4 meters or 20 feet, which seems very unlikely considering rural Colombian architecture. From left to right, Empson represented, first, a lonely seated figure that is reclined on the left column. The figure is apparently male, wears a ruana and a hat, and seems to look sideways at the view. The second group is female, judging from the long skirts or coats, and is comprised of 2 women in black and 1 in white, who stands farthest away from the viewer and closest to the actual balcony. The third group on the right is formed by 2 other figures not easily identified. One of them wears the same red and white ruana as the figure on the far left. In terms of proportion, the fence-style balcony and the depth in which each group is positioned make the reality of the image a bit strange, because the supposed distance between the viewer, artist, or traveler is too short in order for each of these figures to be so small. This observation may allow us to state the fact that this image was not made directly on site and most probably by memory. This is what Catherine Manthorne has explained in regards to Humboldt, when the effort to maintain a verbal commentary running parallel to his images speaks to the need to convey information in a variety of systems, not only to store it, but also to verify it once he was removed from the motif. The aesthetic use of this frame that allows us to see specific traits of geographical elements of the landscape is clearly related to Humboldt's pictorial thought and aesthetic influence. Followers, like Empson and others, read Humboldt's ideas on picturesque landscape and landscape seen through the language of painting. The well-known fact that Humboldt's descriptions were framed in painterly language allows images like Empson's to be seen with these same eyes. Empson, as Humboldt, recognized the difference between his written detailed descriptions of the setting, the mountains, the plants, and the animals of a specific place, and the construction of an image that can transport the reader to a universal picture. He was aware of the difficulties encountered between the visual and the literary when in his memoirs he asks, if painting can only convey a faint idea of the distant mountains, how can language express the emotion produced by the grandeur of a scene, which at one glance reveals to the spectator the extensive range of the majestic Andes, from their broad bases covered with the richest verdure to their untrodden summits clad with eternal snow and rising 15,000 feet above the level of the ocean? When referencing the pictorial systems that Humboldt recommended to German painter Albert Berg, González details human presence as the second system, where the onlooker is generally giving his back to us, contemplating the landscape, and at the same time serving as topographical reference. The theme is the act of contemplating. We look at this picture and become the traveler, just as, according to Humboldt, in Views of Nature, many times the impression that the view of nature produces in us is due less to the character of the region itself than to the day in which the mountains and plains appear illuminated by the transparent blue of the skies or veiled by clouds that near the surface of the earth floats. In the same way, the descriptions of nature impress us all more vividly, the more in harmony they meet the needs of our sensibility, because the physical world is reflected in the most intimate part of our being with all its living truth. How much a landscape gives individual character, the outline of the mountains that limit the horizon in a distant undecided, the darkness of the pine forest, the torrent that escapes from the center of the jungles and crashes with a crash between suspended rocks. Each one of these things has existed at all times in mysterious relationship with the inner life of man. In the Rustic Corridor, subjective observation is the narrative at stake. Locals, dressed in traditional cold weather clothes and hats, enjoy the vista. In this scene, the campesinos change their relationship to the mountains and to the valley beneath as a place of life and work and engage in active aesthetic contemplation of the landscape. This is what Simmel explains when he speaks of the landscape as a construction. Landscape arises when a series of natural phenomena that are found on a piece of Earth's crust are regrouped according to a specific type of unit, a unit different from what the sage's look can be considered with his religious thought, that of the peasant or the strategist with his finalist considerations. The subjects in the drawing are not travelers, have no instruments, and don't seem to incorporate the need to measure, register, or survey. They only look towards the distance. Empson has created a scene that involves fascination and true passive contemplation. The witnesses, divided in groups, do not engage in conversation with each other. They have no luggage, transportation, or any other evidence of travel plans. They behold the mountains and the fertile valley beneath, a view banned for us viewers of the image as we stand with Empson in the far back. Empson is not solely representing the mountains of the Andes. He is confirming the need of any human being standing in this place to stop and behold. The richness of the valley becomes conditional to the height of the mountain range, an evident attitude towards altitude that Simmel had already said is given only in the snowy landscape. Does the low seem to lose its rights over things? When the valley disappears, the pure presence of the high prevails. The high is no longer relative but absolute. It is not a high with respect to a certain low. Looking is the theme of this drawing. Understanding the experience of gazing and regarding is the main role of the reader in Empson's narratives. The title of the Chronicles emphasizes this active participation. It narrates the experience of traveling through mountain-clad 19th century Colombia. It summarizes the role of the image in travel literature, the synthesis of the essential. These mountains might not be physically exact. Even Empson's intention might not have been for us to use GPS location or digitalized maps to discover his exact whereabouts. What is important to understand here is a change in relationship to the landscape. Charles Empson is developing and opening a new space where Colombian inhabitants could stand in awe in front of their own landscape. Appropriation of the land is, in this case as in many, created by the construction of the image, by the integration of nature's elements into a construction brought by European thought. In Humboldt's words, this watercolor can best be explained in terms of life, imagination, and experience. In Views of Nature, the Prussian traveler perfectly expressed that when man interrogates nature with his penetrating curiosity or measures in his imagination the vast spaces of organic creation, of how many emotions he experiences, the feeling that inspires the fullness of life universally scattered is the most powerful and profound. Everywhere, and even near the icy poles, the air resonates with the singing of birds and the hum of insects. Breathe life, not only in the lower layers of the earth where dense vapors float, but in the serene and ethereal regions. Empson faithfully understood this premise, and, like others, equally fascinated with this new approximation to nature and its construction in landscape terms, produced the image before us, one that would always remind us to stop, stand still, observe, and behold the mountains. In the possibility of standing at any high lookout, both foreign travelers and local population would, after Humboldt, find Schiller's words, "In the mountain there is freedom." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Another really interesting paper, which these images remind me a lot of the way in which the English Lake District is depicted in 19th century painting as well. And I think this framing of the way in which these European imaginaries, mountain imaginaries are overlain onto the Andes is a really interesting connection with some of the previous reflections on Eurocentrism. We've got some time for questions, comments. Yes, Rachel? Is there a microphone?
So there's
¿Hay un
1, 2,
micrófono?
1, 2, 3.
Tenemos un micrófono para. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think.
I could just add that most of the images of 19th century, the Colombian landscape was actually more built by the British than by the Germans, through Humboldt and through other ideas. But we have a lot of British travelers, not very few German travelers.
No.
That was terrific. What a beautiful reading of the watercolor. And I mean, it's the sort of image that I would look at and maybe stop looking at quickly, but you're reading illuminated in such a rich way. So thank you. I have a comment and then a question. What you say about how Empson has manipulated the elements to produce an effect is spot on, and I can't help but feel that the mountains themselves, it's not just that they're arrayed for us to see them, they seem as if they're arrayed so they can see us, right? And that strikes me as quite in keeping with Humboldt's theorization of the mysterious relationship between humans and nature and landscape and mind. And it produces a kind of exchange, a cognitive exchange, which leads me to my question. There's so much space in the foreground.
Yes.
Much more than one would imagine there would be in a picturesque view.
In a cottage, in a small cottage also.
Yeah, and much more than is needed, even too much, because if he'd reduce the amount of space in the foreground, he'd have more room for the good stuff. So can you say a little bit about what that rather large
This
might
image
be
has been really enigmatic for me because again, if I compare them really quickly with all of the other images, something is not working. Every technology is working against me. With the other images that he made on the mountains, this one, it also seems a bit mediocre in terms of the drawing of the landscape, because in the other images, as I was saying, he uses all of this perspective, atmospheric perspective and the mist, and it's part of what's fascinating about these images. And the original, the first edition of the book that we have at the Bank of the Republic, they're actually hand-colored, and some of them are hand-colored. And he did kind of take the time to describe the landscape in that way. And then in the other image, I find it so strange and fascinating. This that you're saying, they look kind of schematic, the mountains. And I'm not sure if it has to do with having them look at us or having them fit into this frame, as well as the other space. Like he had to foreshorten the frame in order to fit, because it's too good to be true that they fit between the poles, and then he can have these people observing. And then again, the idea of cottage is really off also, right? Because you would never have all of this blank space, because constructions would be a lot smaller. And so that part is interesting, and I'm also fascinating, as I was commenting a question on Alan Braddocks, the composition for me is and I think it has to do with my education as a painter, but it has to do also with the three groups being under the three mountains. But they do seem like he didn't work that much on them, and he was more interested in the actual cottage and in the little people than actually in this magnificent view, which is strange. And he actually does use the foreground, the other mountains on the foreground. He works a little bit on them, but you never have the detail in this image that you have in all of these images. There's the beautiful flowers, there's insects, there's birds, and then there's this kind of idea of building the one image of what it is to stand on the Cordilleras. But it's actually, for me, the most interesting, but the one that does the less justice to the landscape.
There's a question here and then a question there. Yeah.
I'll be brief. Thanks for a great talk. You're making an artist I knew nothing about very interesting, so thanks. And kind of picking up on Rachel's question, in addition to the three mountains, we have three trees. And the artist seems to have lavished more attention on articulating the plants
over here
that hang down almost
the
like
poles.
eyelashes of an eyeball looking out at the scene. And yet I don't want to just see this as an anthropomorphic image for the very reasons that we've been talking about. He animates these non-human forms in very interesting ways. Do you want to go there into a kind of conversation about anthropomorphism and animism? Or?
I hadn't thought about it, and I still think I can spend quite some more time with this image. I think it has to do more with the picturesque. And with finding gilpin and finding this idea of the roughness and this kind of nature that kind of controls the human build, but not exactly. I think there's still some of that there. I've actually wanted to go more into the image as we were talking before the conference with the idea of the indigenous also, because he precisely uses local, not necessarily, it's kind of strange to know if, I wouldn't dare say yet if they're indigenous or if they're just like the campesinos and the people from the locals, but it's really interesting that he chooses them and he's not using other British travelers that are observing the landscape. So there's something there. And it's what is very strange is that the volcano on the left is a really impressive volcano, and then on the image, and it's really important for the indigenous mythology also. So there's a lot. I still have to go more into the image.
One final question.
Thanks, congratulations. First of all, Empson is the English translator of Farbenlehre, the Goethe's Farbenlehre, the theory of colors of Goethe. He also knew the ancient art, especially the Pompeii mosaics, where you could see for example, the Alexander the Great, the battle. In the battle, he is disproportionately with the other
large. Yes.
persons in the picture. So, do you think he is trying to take into account the Goethe's colors theory? Yeah, especially, do you think he is related with this kind of perspective that became from the ancient art? I mean, it's probably a very quite general question, but
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because
with Humboldt, especially, and the scientific thought of Humboldt, what is specifically in this kind of images?
Yes.
The relation between them.
I'm not sure, because one thing that is very enigmatic also, and I haven't found too much information on Charles Empson in Colombia yet, but is that he was a botanist. So one thing that I've wondered about this image is, where is the botanist in this image? Again, with the foreground, flat sand foreground, and with the usage of the color. But I'm not sure if, I think the classical is part of the composition, and he's mixing that idea of the classical, and he's also mixing Humboldt's ideas about size. When he writes to Humboldt corresponds with Albert Berg. Well, and he writes to him, you should use these three systems, which would be the crowning of the landscape, and then the size of the people, and then the actual observation, having people observe the landscape. And I think it would have to do more with that than actual kind of classical thought in terms of landscape. What I have found on very recently on Charles Empson is that he was the uncle of a very important anesthesiologist in England, and that there's some other documents that still haven't been explored on him. But I find him more on that, again, picturesque British side than on the actual German kind of tendency to look at those elements. He spends most of his book describing the plants. Most of the book describing the plants. He describes the sounds of the birds and the colors in nature. But I'm not sure if he was reading into Goethe's color theory yet.
Okay. If it's extremely quick, because I've been told that we need to wrap up. Thanks. Yeah.
Sorry, just a lingering thought that adds on to the discussion here. And thanks for the terrific talk. I'm convinced, in the comparison to his other works, that this is indeed a picture about looking. But I'm wondering if in the centering effect of these mountains, and also in the focus on looking, subjective looking itself, there's also a kind of decentering and desubjectification that also happens. Namely, there's a picture within a picture here.
Yes.
But it's also a kind of arbitrary one, right? Because the function of the naturalist, in a way, is to show, I haven't composed a picture. This is how the world looks, right? So to to have the artistic frame around a watercolor or a canvas or whatever puts too much subjective presence on the part of the artist, but to have this kind of internal frame of a picture in a picture is more arbitrary. As likewise, the size of the figures magnify the landscape, but they also put them in dialogue with the trees that are scattered beyond them.
Yes.
To suggest that these kind of arbitrary landscapes aren't just framed here, but continue on.
And then the fact of the three groupings doesn't give all the power to just the one onlooker. Like, this is not Caspar David Friedrich's onlooker on the mountains with this. No, they're kind of divided. They're all looking at different things probably. So yeah, that's really interesting. And the relationship with the trees is very interesting. It's also fascinating that the palm tree that's on the right seems to be a, I'm not sure what the word in English is, but it's a palma de cera, like the wax palm trees, which is really, really, really high and really stylized. And he kind of places it here at a lower size, like still growing. And I think it would also have to do so that it doesn't compete with the cottage, so that it doesn't compete visually with the cottage. It's just like a compositional element to kind of break the size. Also, everything is framed, and then that would leave nature on the outside of the frame.
So you have this kind of repetitive panoptic kind of viewing, which seems to line up with Alan's argument about a kind of the ideological function of the seeming harmonizing of empire. That it's not a kind of trained vision at all.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for Veronica. I'd just like to thank all four speakers from this session for really fantastic papers. I expect you're all very hungry, so we have a lunch break now, and the next session starts at 4 o'clock. Thank you.